Frankfurt and main ground. Frankfurt and main ground, clear to taxi, Air China 0932. LH1090, ready to start up. Frankfurt and main startup, this is LH1090, position B117, information night, IFR to Marseille Province, request startup. LH1090, startup approved, Mike correct, runway 07R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.80, Frankfurt and main startup control. Frankfurt and main startup approved, Mike correct, runway 07R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.80, LH1090. Frankfurt and main startup, switching to 121.80, LH1090. Frankfurt and main startup, with you, LH1090. LH1090, Roger, Frankfurt and main startup. Frankfurt and main startup, request pushback, LH1090. LH1090, pushback approved, Frankfurt and main startup. Frankfurt and main ground, ready to taxi, LH1090. LH1090, clear to taxi, Frankfurt and main ground. Frankfurt and main ground, clear to taxi, LH1090. A330-300, hold position, Frankfurt and main ground. Frankfurt and main ground, holding position, A330-300. LH1484, ready to start up. A330-300, resume taxiing, Frankfurt and main ground. Frankfurt and main ground, continuing taxi, A330-300. Frankfurt and main startup, this is LH1484, position 828, information Mike, IFR to call Medina Lorca, request startup.
2,500.
LH1484, startup approved, Mike correct, runway 07R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.80, Frankfurt and main startup control. Frankfurt and main startup approved, Mike correct, runway 07R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.80, LH1484. Frankfurt and main startup, switching to 121.80, LH1484.
Traffic.
Frankfurt and main startup, review, LH1484. LH1484, Roger, Frankfurt and main startup.
2,000. 2,000.
Defend now. Defend now. Defend.
Frankfurt and main startup, request pushback, LH1484. LH1484, pushback approved, Frankfurt and main startup. Frankfurt and main ground, ready to taxi, LH1484. LH1484, clear to taxi, Frankfurt and main ground. Frankfurt and main ground, clear to taxi, LH1484.
Traffic.
Minimum 200.
LH036, ready to start up. LH1284, ready to start up.
40.
LH1374,
20.
ready to start up.
10. Retard.
LH1312, ready to start up. KL1774, ready to start up. Flight 356, ready to start up. Startup, this is LH036, position B10 information mic, IFR to Hamburg, request startup. Frankfurt and main startup, this is LH1374, position B93, information mic, IFR to Strahis, request startup. Frankfurt and main startup, this is KL1774, position G003, information mic, IFR to Chapal, request startup. Frankfurt and main startup, this is LH1312, position B106, information mic, IFR to La Vallejuca, request startup. Frankfurt and main startup, this is La 356, position B155, information mic, IFR to Tel Aviv Ben Gurion, request startup. LH1374, startup approved, mic correct, runway 07R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.80, Frankfurt and main startup control. LH1312, startup approved, Mike correct, runway 07R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.80, Frankfurt and main startup control. KL1774, startup approved, Mike correct, runway 07R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.80, Frankfurt and main startup control. Fly 356, startup approved, Mike correct, runway 07R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for taxi clearance call 121.80, Frankfurt and main startup control. LH036, startup approved, Mike correct, runway 07R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for taxi clearance call 121.80, Frankfurt and main startup control. Frankfurt and main startup approved, Mike correct, runway 07R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.80, LH1374. Frankfurt and main startup approved, Mike correct, runway 07R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.80, KL1774. Frankfurt and main startup approved, Mike correct, runway 07R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for taxi clearance call 121.80, fly 356. Frankfurt and main startup approved, Mike startup control. Frankfurt and main startup approved, Mike correct, runway 07R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.80, LH1284. Frankfurt and main startup, switching to 121.80, LH1374. Frankfurt and main startup, switching to 121.80, LH1312. Frankfurt and main startup, with you, LH1312. Frankfurt and main startup, with you, LH1374. Frankfurt and main startup, switching to 121.80, KL1774. LH1312, Roger, Frankfurt and main startup. Frankfurt and main startup, switching to 121.80, LH036. LH1374, Roger, Frankfurt and main startup, with you, Y356.
50,
LH036,
30,
Roger, Frankfurt and main startup.
retard,
Frankfurt and main startup, request taxi clearance, LH036. Frankfurt and main startup, request pushback, LH1374. LH1374, pushback approved, Frankfurt and main startup. LH036, cleared to taxi, Frankfurt and main startup. Frankfurt and main startup, request pushback, LH1312. LH1312, pushback approved, Frankfurt and main startup. KL1774, pushback ground. Fly 356, Roger, Frankfurt and main startup. Frankfurt and main ground, cleared to taxi, LH1374. LH1284, Roger, Frankfurt and main startup. Frankfurt and main startup, request pushback, LH1284. Frankfurt and main startup, request taxi clearance, Fly 356. Frankfurt and main ground, ready to taxi, LH1312. Fly 356, cleared to taxi, Frankfurt and main startup. LH1312, cleared to taxi, Frankfurt and main ground. LH1284, pushback approved, Frankfurt and main startup. Frankfurt and main ground, cleared to taxi, LH1312. Frankfurt and main ground, ready to taxi, KL1774. KL1774, cleared to taxi, Frankfurt and main ground. Frankfurt and main ground, cleared to taxi, KL1774. Frankfurt and main ground, ready to taxi, LH1284. LH1284, cleared to taxi, Frankfurt and main ground. Frankfurt and main ground, cleared to taxi, LH1284. LH1422, ready to start up. Arizona 419, ready to start up. Frankfurt and main startup, this is LH1422, position A66A, information Mike, IFR to Bucharest Toto Penny Intel, request startup. Frankfurt and main startup, this is Arizona 419, position V162, information Mike, IFR to Milano Limate, request startup. LH1422, startup approved, Mike correct, runway 07R, fly runway